Secret bases in Antarctica, Nazi technology, military cover-ups, and flying saucers are just scratching the surface of today's topic. Near the end of 1946, the United States launched the largest mission to Antarctica, but the result of that mission was catastrophic defeat by an unknown enemy. Admiral Richard E. Byrd, who is one of the most decorated admirals in the US history, led the expedition, and he left some very interesting traces behind that tell a story quite different compared to the official one. And at the end, I'll show you a few very strange deaths that the cover-up of this event left behind. This topic personally got me into the subject of UFOs when I was a kid, and if you haven't guessed it already, this video is about the Operation Highjump. Whoa, let's get into this. Operation Highjump was and still is the largest Antarctic expedition that took place in history, and I don't say that lightly. It consisted of over 4,700 military personnel which were armed to their teeth. They brought with them 13 ships, 33 aircraft, icebreakers, and even a combat submarine. That sounds like an overkill for a scientific expedition and a military exercise, doesn't it? Adding to the weight of that mission is the fact that it was led by Admiral Richard E. Byrd. He wasn't your ordinary military guy by any stretch of the imagination. On the contrary, Admiral Byrd is one of the most decorated people in American history. He had been awarded the Medal of Honor, the Navy Cross, the Flying Cross, and the Silver Life-Saving Medal, along with 22 commendations for honor and bravery. He was simply the best of the best that the US military had to offer, and he wasn't the person to lie or imagine crazy stories. Also, the Second World War just ended, and it's not like the US had resources to throw around. Sending an expedition of these proportions would have been strange regardless of when it happened, unless the Allied forces knew something we didn't. Before the Second World War started, Hitler was already preparing for it. And as strange as it sounds, he was a prominent figure in the Thule Society. This will make much more sense in a minute, so stick with me. Never before or after in history has a society progressed scientifically like Germany in the 20th century. Something we all forget is that the occult was so deeply integrated into their beliefs that science without it simply didn't exist. Going even further, Nazi Germany's beliefs were solely based on the teachings of this secretive group, and the person in the center of it all was Maria Orsic, a woman whose beliefs might have shaped the atrocities Hitler later brought to life under her teachings. She was an extremely beautiful woman, but under all of that was hidden an immensely powerful psychic. She claimed to have been in contact with an alien race from another galaxy called the Boomy, and they claimed to have created a human race. She would draw out schematics and plans for building craft that could reach their home planet. But what ties her into this whole story is the account in which they told her that they also resided on Earth. Can you guess where the location of that place might be?
Send me location.
Yup, they were under the Antarctic ice. This is the reason why in the year 1938, SS Schwabenland set off to Antarctica. This top-secret mission's objective was to search for the extraterrestrials Maria Orsic had been in contact with and set up a hidden base. They mapped hundreds of thousands of miles, and while doing so, they discovered a place that shouldn't even be possible in those harsh conditions. They discovered a patch of land that was covered by greenery and blue lakes. This is the location where they supposedly set up a base that would later be called Base 211. This complex was so extensive that when the British forces went in to investigate, they were completely overpowered. This information comes from a top-secret British mission, very similar to the Operation Highjump. I'll tell you that story in one of my future videos, so subscribe if you don't want to miss it. For now, let's get back to the United States side of the story. How Americans learned of this base's existence was during the post-war trials where Karl Dönitz, the man who briefly succeeded Hitler after the war ended, said this.
The German submarine fleet is proud of having been built for the Führer in another part of the world, an impregnable fortress, a paradise-like oasis in the middle of eternal ice.
This statement had a threatening tone to it because much of German technology and equipment had been shipped off in the months leading to their defeat. With the threat of Nazi Germany making a comeback with new, advanced technology, launching a mission of these proportions would make much more sense. That's the reason why in August of 1946 the Operation Highjump had started. American forces reached the Antarctic continent in January of 1947, and their mission was simple: capture any German technology they could and destroy the base 211. Their operation was supposed to last 8 months, but that proved to be impossible because as soon as they arrived, they started reporting encounters with strange flying discs. They were having difficulties even exploring the terrain properly. Dozens of their aircrafts had been destroyed and the ship had been sunk. Personnel have been reported to have died, but due to the classified nature of the mission's report, we never really found out how many. Admiral Richard E. Byrd himself had an episode of missing time in which he was out of radio contact for 3 hours. This will be important, so remember it for later. Even though this mission was supposed to last much longer, it was cut short and it ended just 40 days after their arrival. The American convoy was forced to retrieve to Chile, and that's where Admiral Byrd gave a chilling statement. See what I did there? Okay. Anyway, in the interview Admiral Byrd gave to the Chilean press, he said the following.
Admiral Byrd declared today that it was imperative for the United States to initiate immediate defense measures against hostile regions. The Admiral further stated that he didn't want to frighten anyone unduly, but that it was a bitter reality. That in case of a new war, the continental United States would be attacked by flying objects which could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Admiral Byrd repeated the above points of view resulting from his personal knowledge gathered both at the North and South Poles before a news conference held for the International News Service.
The Admiral gave this statement to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio, but that was sadly the last thing he ever said publicly on the matter of the Operation Highjump, because right after he returned to the US, all of his diaries and documents from the mission were immediately confiscated and classified top secret. He was also interrogated intensely by the Secret Service, and all members of his crew were reminded that if they ever spoke about what happened during their time they spent in Antarctica, they would be thrown in prison under the charges of treason. But remember how Admiral Byrd had those 3 hours of missing time? Well, we might actually know what happened to him because he kept a secret diary. The log starts early in the morning. Admiral is preparing for a scouting mission and everything seems normal at first. He takes off and makes radio contact with the base camp at 08:15. He continues his flight and at 0910 hours, he notices that the ground is starting to change. Confused with what is happening, he circles around to get a closer look and makes visual contact with the base. Deciding that the situation is weird but nothing out of the ordinary, he continues his flight, but then something starts happening. His instruments start going wild, the compasses in the craft start spinning out of control, and he decides to orient using the sun. He writes in his journal that the plane's controls feel numb, and he makes a visual check on the wings to see if they are icing up. There is a bit of frost there, but nothing that could cause serious issues, so he continues his flight towards the mountain range in the distance. This is when he starts to realize that something isn't right.
0949 hours 29 minutes elapsed flight time from the first sighting of the mountains. It is no illusion. There should be no green valley below. Something is definitely wrong and abnormal here. We should be over ice and snow. To the port side are great forests growing on the mountain slopes. Our navigation instruments are still spinning. The gyroscope is oscillating back and forth.
He was confused because of this change in scenery. He was flying over the South Pole and this shouldn't be possible. He quickly snapped back to reality, however, as he noticed that the lighting had changed and he no longer saw the sun. This is a problem because he was using the sun to navigate. He looks down to the ground and he can't believe what he's seeing. On the ground below him is a huge animal that looks like a mammoth. Admiral Byrd found himself flying over miles of greenery with large lakes in all directions. He was feeling uncomfortably warm, so he decided to check the temperature, and his instruments were showing him that it was 74 degrees outside. The instruments were back to normal, but his radio was completely gone. This coincides with the official report where he was gone for 3 hours. He starts to look around again and he sees something that he couldn't have even imagined. He sees a brightly lit city with buildings made out of crystals. He tries to change his course, but the controls aren't working. Before he has time to troubleshoot them, he notices 2 disc-shaped crafts rapidly approaching him from both sides of the airplane. As the saucers came closer, he recognized the markings on them and the cold sweat starts sinking in. The crafts escorting him, well, they had swastikas on them.
1145 hours, I am making a hasty last entry in the flight log. Several men are approaching on foot toward the aircraft. They are tall with blonde hair, In the distance is a large shimmering city pulsating with rainbow hues of color.
This was the last entry Admiral Byrd wrote down in real time, as the rest is written from memory later on. Strangely, the men he was describing matched the description of boomy aliens Maria Orse had been in contact with. Nevertheless, these strange men escorted the Admiral to the Shining City, where he was being brought to have a word with a being called the Master. This man introduced his people as Ariani, and he claims that they have been the original inhabitants of our planet and that they serve as its protectors. He further tells him that they're very aware of what goes on the surface, and that this event had been planned and that the Admiral had been brought there to deliver a very important message to the leaders of his country.
Our interest readily begins just after your race exploded the first atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. It was at that alarming time we sent our flying machines to your surface world to investigate what your race had done. That is, of course, past history now, my dear Admiral, but I must continue on. You see, we have never interfered before in your race's wars and barbarity, but now we must, for you have learned to tamper with a certain power that is not for man, namely, that of atomic energy. Our emissaries have already delivered messages to the powers of your world, and yet they do not heed. Now you have been chosen to be witness here that our world does exist.
After this meeting, Admiral Byrd was escorted back to his plane and then shown a way back to the surface world, and after that, he stayed quiet for a while. That is, until he writes the final entry in his diary, which happened on March 11th in 1947, where he explains that after his return home, he passed along the message from the Master to his superiors, and that he was detained and interrogated by the national security personnel for over 6 hours. After this whole ordeal had ended, he was ordered to remain silent, and they reminded him that he is a military man and that he must obey orders. Now, this diary had been under much scrutiny over the years, and rightfully so. For starters, there are some serious mistakes in the beginning of his writing, like the fact that he talks about him flying over the North Pole, not the South. Further, the text itself contains a lot of exclamation points which we can't see in any of his other writings, ever. This leads me to believe that the diary is a fake, or at least a poorly constructed story around something he did write down. You would think that this is where the story ends, but the legitimacy of this diary does not put the events described in it out of the question, because what followed his return from the Antarctic is real and is downright disturbing. Admiral Byrd did give a statement to the Chilean press in which he talked about dangerous craft attacking from the poles with capabilities far exceeding the possible technology at the time. He was also questioned rigorously, and all of his possessions were confiscated immediately after returning home, with everything being classified as top secret. He never again mentioned anything regarding the mission, but our trail does not run cold here. Actually, the complete opposite. It becomes even more interesting because after all this time, we can connect some very disturbing events that followed the people involved with this mission. The then Secretary of the US Navy and later the first Secretary of Defense in the US's history, a person directly behind the Operation Highjump and Admiral Byrd's direct superior, was Admiral James Forrestal. This man is one of the founding members of the secret organization inside of the US called the Majestic 12, an organization that was responsible for controlling the information spread regarding the UFO phenomenon. If this sounds interesting and you would like to see a video on this topic, like the video and let me know in the comments below. Admiral James Forrestal was a seriously impressive man, but he's sadly remembered today for his extremely mysterious death that followed the Operation Highjump. His death is one of the most compelling instances of a cover-up we've seen because every single event leading to it is just suspicious. I mean, just weeks before he died, President Truman removed him from office without any warnings. This is important because this would revoke his status as a government employee, which makes the following events just straight up illegal. He was promptly transported by a Navy airplane to the National Naval Medical Center, where he was locked in a room on the 16th floor of the facility against his will for a total of 7 weeks. His official diagnosis was severe depression, but the way he was treated sounds more like a prison cell than anything else. As I said, this would have been completely illegal as he was no longer a government employee. His brother tried to visit him on several occasions, but most of his requests had been declined. Adding to this, just days before the Admiral was supposed to be released, he talked to his brother about how happy he was, and they even made plans for the future. Those plans would never come to pass, however, because just hours before he was being released, Forrestal jumped from the 16th story directly to his death. This was immediately ruled out as and there was no official investigation. He didn't leave any kind of note behind, and the initial press release stated that he had been found with a cord around his neck. Even more puzzling is the fact that in the official report, his death was reported as a fall, and no jump has ever been mentioned. This makes me wonder whether he wanted to go public with some information that would threaten the narrative the MJ-12 was trying to keep, and if it had to do anything with the Operation Highjump. Another unfortunate event that seems to have followed this mission was the case of Admiral Richard E. Byrd's own son. In the October of 1988, a homeless man was found in an abandoned warehouse in Baltimore, Maryland. That homeless man later on turned out to be Richard Byrd Jr., and that would be understandable if he had any history of substance or alcohol abuse, but on the contrary, he was a well-educated and serious father of 4. Less than a month before he was found in a warehouse, he left his home and boarded a train in Boston as he was going to a ceremony in Washington, D.C. to honor his father's journeys to the polar regions. What's strange is that he never made it to the event, and his last 3 weeks of life remain a complete mystery. The only thing we do know is that he died over dehydration and malnutrition. His sons later gave a statement in which they claimed that their father always idolized Admiral Byrd, and he was often drawn to a specific expedition his father went on in the mid-40s. If we take a look at what mission they could possibly be talking about, we're only left with the Operation Highjump. This interestingly happened only 4 years after the secret diary of Admiral Byrd was released to the public, and it only makes me think of the possibility that his son released some of the information left behind to his family by Admiral Byrd. If anything in the journal is credible, who would be better positioned than his own son to have access to such information? We will probably never get the definite answers, but these events pose interesting questions no matter how you choose to feel regarding this story. There really was an encounter with a German submarine which is surprisingly well documented just a few months before the Operation Highjump commenced. That encounter occurred 18 months after the war ended, and it was documented by an Icelandic whale hunting ship called Julian. This strange event happened out of nowhere. A German U-boat surfaced right next to them, and the submarine's captain boarded their ship. The Nazi officer demanded a portion of their supplies in fluent English, adding that if they do not cooperate, it wouldn't end well for the crew. As they had no real choices, they complied, and in return, the German officer paid him in American dollars, and they even tipped every crew member with $10, which would in today's currency be around 150. The Germans also informed them of a location where a large number of whales were, and that information turned out to be true. We have to remember that the whereabouts of more than 100 German U-boats still remain unknown to this day, even if we take into consideration the unconfirmed sinkings of German submarines. We're still left with a staggering number of vessels that are unaccounted for, which begs the question of what really happened during the end of the Second World War. The Operation Highjump remains one of the most interesting rabbit holes in this field of research. The connection between Nazi Germany's activity on the continent, mixed with their history of the occult, leaves us with more questions than answers. The eerie similarities between the boomy aliens Maria Orsic claimed to be in contact with and the Ariani civilization described in the alleged diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd are extremely close. If we consider everything else we know about this event, it makes an extremely interesting case, but I will let you decide what is true and what isn't. I also mentioned the secret British mission very similar to the Operation Highjump, and that is the Operation Tabarin. I'll be making a video on it soon, so subscribe to the channel and ding the notification bell if you don't want to miss it. There are still so many topics left to unpack just from this story alone, and I can't wait to bring you more videos on them as well. I hope you took something new and interesting from today's video, but for now, this will be it. As always, I wish you good luck in your research and thank you for staying until the end. This has been the UFO Lab and I'll catch you in the next one.